I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was there. I saw every second of it. And even now, years later, when I close my eyes in the dark and let myself go back, I still get that feeling in my chest. That tight, breathless thing that isn't quite fear and isn't quite pride. It's something in between. Something I don't have a clean word for. Maybe humans don't have a word for it because we've never needed one until now. Because nothing in human history, not a single war, not a single disaster, not a single moment of quiet heroism on a forgotten street corner, nothing prepared us for what it felt like to be seen by the galaxy for the first time. And not just seen. Feared. They looked at us and they saw soft things. Pink-skinned, water-soaked, fragile little creatures who needed pressurized suits to breathe vacuum and warm clothes to survive their own planet's poles. They saw beings who slept, voluntarily dropped into unconsciousness for 8 hours out of every 24. They saw animals who cried, who laughed until they couldn't breathe, who ran toward things that frightened them. They thought all of that was weakness. Every single one of them did. Right up until the moment Sergeant Cale Oren walked into that hangar bay with nothing but his bare hands, a busted rib, and 17 years of stubborn human rage, and showed 4 Vethkai shock troopers exactly what apex predator means when it's wearing a human face. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Section II setup. Kareth Station wasn't beautiful. I want to be honest about that. It sat in the outer meridian belt like a rusted knuckle, half-finished and perpetually groaning from the temperature differentials that the belt's twin suns created every 43 hours. The station had been built in 3 separate phases by 3 separate species across 60 years of stops and starts, and you could tell. One section was Gren-built, all smooth curves and bioluminescent material that pulsed faintly in the dark. Another was Tirath construction, brutalist, angular, heavy with exposed conduit and pipes the diameter of a human torso. And the human-built section, added 15 years ago when Earth finally got a seat at the compact table, was somehow both messier and more functional than either. Improvised, adaptive, a little embarrassing to look at but impossible to argue with when everything was actually working. I was stationed there as part of the ILC's Forward Attaché program. Basically, Earth wanted representatives embedded in neutral space facilities before the larger political machinery caught up. It was a goodwill posting, a handshake in the form of a uniform. I was 28 years old. I'd done 2 years on Luna Base and 18 months on the Ganymede Relay, and I genuinely thought, that I understood what interspecies contact felt like. I didn't, not even close. Kareth had roughly 4,000 permanent residents and a rotating transit population that could spike to 12,000 during trade convergences. The species mix was extraordinary. Gren, Tirath, Shalav, Keth, a small Voan enclave in the lower ring, and newest and most watched, about 300 humans spread across administrative, technical and military liaison roles. We were new, everyone knew it. You could feel it in the way the older species watched us. Not hostile exactly. More like the way you watch a child reach for something hot, that particular tension of waiting to see if they actually touch it. The Vethkai were different. The Vethkai didn't watch us with caution or curiosity, or that particular brand of condescending patience that the Gren had practically turned into an art form. The Vethkai watched us the way a butcher watches livestock. Assessing, measuring, deciding. They'd arrived 6 months before the incident. 40 of them, officially classified as a commercial security delegation under compact law. Compact law, for what it's worth, was about as enforceable in the outer meridian as Earth traffic laws were on a Tuesday night in Lagos during festival season, technically real, practically aspirational. The Vethkai were tall, taller than humans by a significant margin, built like something evolution had decided should be good at hurting things. Bilateral symmetry like us, but 4 upper limbs instead of 2, and a central neural cluster, their version of a brain distributed across the upper thorax rather than sitting in the skull. That last part mattered later. You'll understand why. Their skin was a dark chitinous material, not quite armor but not quite soft tissue either. It absorbed radiation that would fry a human in minutes. Their eyes, 2 primary, 2 secondary, could process in spectrums we needed instruments to see. They could survive hard vacuum for up to 12 minutes without a suit. They healed from wounds that would kill most species outright. And they knew all of this. That was the thing about the Vethkai that nobody ever quite captures in the official compact briefings. It wasn't just that they were physically formidable. It was that they wore it. It was in the way they moved through Kareth's corridors, unhurried, unbothered, taking up space like they decided the station was already theirs and were simply tolerating the current occupants. It was in the way their senior officer, a Vethkai whose name translated roughly as Commander Who Decides Wait, we called him Decimator, privately looked at the human section of the station. Not with hostility. With boredom. As if we were so far below the threshold of threat that the whole question of us was simply tedious. I remember the first time I passed a group of them in the main transit corridor. 6 Vethkai in their characteristic dark gray operational suits, moving in formation even off-duty because that's just how they were. I was carrying a data slate and a cup of something the station's fabricator insisted was coffee. I was tired. I'd been on comms rotation for 16 hours and my eyes felt like someone had replaced them with sandpaper. One of the Vethkai, young, I thought, based on the brightness of the secondary eyes, looked directly at me as we passed. Not a greeting, not a challenge, just a look. The kind of look that says, I see what you are. I'm not worried about it. I kept walking, drank my terrible coffee, wrote a note in my personal log that night. The Vethkai don't think we're dangerous. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a problem. It was a problem. I just didn't know how big yet. Section III the days before. The trade convergence started 3 weeks after the Vethkai arrived. Kareth bloomed. That's the only word for it. The population swelled to nearly 10,000 within the first week, ships queuing in the approach lanes so thickly that the traffic management AIs were running at full capacity and still falling behind. The docking bays worked triple shifts. The fabricators ran continuously. The corridors smelled of a dozen different species metabolic byproducts, and the particular electrical tang that meant somebody's power coupling was on the edge of failing. It was loud and crowded and occasionally genuinely alarming, and I loved every second of it. This was why we were here, not just humans, everyone. This was the galaxy actually working. Trade and exchange, and the gradual, grinding, glorious process of different minds learning to coexist. The Vethkai watched it all with the same expression. Bored, assessing, waiting. We found out later, much later, during the tribunal, that they'd spent those 3 weeks doing something very specific. Mapping us. Not the station, us, the humans specifically. They'd cataloged our rotation schedules, our response times, our physical limitations. They knew our bone density was lower than Tirath but higher than Shalev. They knew our pain thresholds varied wildly by individual. They knew we needed sleep, needed food at regular intervals, needed oxygen specifically in concentrations that most of the station's common areas maintained by luck rather than design. They knew we had only 12 combat-rated personnel on the station at the time of the convergence. 12, against 40 Vethkai who were all, every single one of them, trained soldiers. They knew that if they made their move during the peak of the convergence, when the station was overwhelmed, when the corridors were packed, when the communications channels were saturated, the response time from any compact enforcement vessel would be 6 hours minimum. 6 hours. They'd done the math, carefully, precisely. the way predators do when they've decided the hunt is worth it. What they hadn't done, what none of them had thought to do, was account for the things they didn't understand. Because there were things they didn't understand about humans. A lot of things. Section IV, the morning it started. Day 11 of the convergence. I know the exact time, 3:47 station hours. I know because I was awake. Not on duty, I'd finished my shift at midnight. But I couldn't sleep. The station was making a sound I didn't like, a low harmonic resonance through the hull that I'd been told was normal thermal expansion from the binary sun cycle, but that my body refused to believe was harmless. I was lying on my bunk in my quarters in the human section, staring at the ceiling when the alarm went. Not the general alarm. The ILC emergency channel, a specific three-tone sequence that meant something had happened to one of our people. I was in the corridor with my boots half-laced in about 45 seconds. The message on my slate was terse. 6 words from station security: incident in Bay 7, multiple casualties. I started running. Bay 7 was in the Charath-built section, which meant low ceilings by Charath standards, still high enough for me, and that particular brutalist lighting that turned everything a dull amber. It also meant the nearest human quarters were nearly 8 minutes away at a jog through the convergence crowd. I covered it in 5. What I found when I got there was already being contained by station security. 3 Gren in the reflective silver suits they wore on duty, talking into communicators, looking around the bay entrance with the particular stillness that meant they were disturbed but trained not to show it. Inside, 4 members of a Keth trade delegation. On the floor, alive but barely. One had a fractured carapace across the upper thorax. Another had what I could only describe as crushed damage to 2 of her primary manipulators, bones ground, basically. The Keth don't have bones exactly, but the equivalent was shattered, and the sound she was making was something I had to consciously push out of my thoughts afterward. The Gren security chief, a being named Os who I'd dealt with before and trusted, pulled me aside immediately. Vethkai, she said, just that one word. Confirmed. 3 witnesses, different species, all consistent accounts. She paused. The Gren do this thing when they're disturbed, a faint bioluminescent flicker that they can't fully control. Os was flickering. They asked the Keth delegation to move. The Keth did not move quickly enough. They did this because someone didn't move fast enough. They did this as a demonstration, Os said. That was the word one witness used, demonstration. I stood there for a moment in the amber light of Bay 7, looking at those 4 Keth on the floor, and felt something I hadn't felt since before my postings. Something old and biological, and very specifically human. Something that lives in the back of the skull, and speaks in a voice without words. I felt it settle in and make itself comfortable. That was the moment I understood we were not going to be able to talk our way through whatever was coming. Section V, build tension. The next 4 hours were controlled chaos. Station Commander Rel Agren, senior in every sense, 40 years on the station, convened an emergency session in the operations center. 12 people around the table. Gren, Tirath, Shalav, 2 Keth representatives who were understandably not inclined toward calm, and me, the most junior person in the room by roughly a factor of 3. Compact protocol for a Vethkai incident required formal notification, a cooling period, mediated dialogue. Standard process, civilized. The Vethkai delegation's response to the formal notification, delivered by a Gren junior officer with admirable nerve, was to close and lock the doors to their section and broadcast a single message on the general station channel. I still have the translation saved. I've read it probably 200 times. The beings of Karath Station are hereby informed that the Vethkai delegation has determined this facility to be inadequately governed. We will be assuming administrative oversight of key functions beginning at the next station cycle. Resistance will be treated as aggression. We are not interested in dialogue at this time. 40 lines in compact diplomatic language, reduced to that. The operations room went very quiet. Commander Rel looked at the Tirath representative. The Tirath representative looked at the Shalav. The Shalav looked at me. I was the junior ILC attaché, 28 years old. My combat rating was basic, enough to qualify for the posting, not enough to matter in a real engagement. My job was liaison, paperwork, translation, goodwill. Everyone was looking at me because I was human, and the Vethkai had, in 6 months of watching us, been very clear about what they thought of humans, which meant everyone else was now very anxious to know what humans were going to do. Honestly, in that moment I didn't know either. I sent 3 messages. The first was to ILC Command, with a full situation report and a request for emergency extraction or support. Response time estimate, 4 to 6 hours minimum, probably 8. The second was to the human section, all personnel regardless of rotation. It wasn't an order, I didn't have the authority to give orders. It was a heads up. Something is happening, be aware, be ready. The third was to Sergeant Kale Oren. Let me tell you about Kale. Section VI, KALORIN. Kale had been in the Earth Expeditionary Defense Force for 17 years when I met him on Karath. He was 41, dark-skinned, compact, the kind of build that doesn't look like much until you notice that everything is exactly the right size and nothing is wasted. He had a scar along his left jaw from his second posting, Titan Station, an incident with a Vorn mechanical malfunction that he described as basically a disagreement about physics, and a habit of drinking tea at all hours that the station's other human staff found reassuring for reasons none of us could quite articulate. He was the senior military liaison on Karath, which meant, in practice, that he was responsible for the safety and security of every human on the station, with a team of 11 other combat-rated personnel, and whatever the station's existing security infrastructure could offer. Against 40 Vethkai, in a station that was currently holding nearly 10,000 beings across multiple species. When I told him the situation, he didn't panic. He didn't get excited in the way I'd seen other soldiers get excited at the prospect of action, that particular bright-eyed energy that always worried me. He just nodded, set down his tea, looked at the situation map I'd pulled up. They're going to go for the life support controls first, he said. Secondary target will be communications. They won't touch the fabricators because they need those for themselves. How confident are you? He looked at me, because that's what I do. Then he said something that I think about a lot. They think they've calculated this. They've run the numbers on us, our size, our reaction time, our physical limits. A pause. They haven't run the numbers on what we'll do when something we care about is threatened. And what will we do? Kale Oren picked up his tea again, finished it. Whatever it takes, he said. That's not bravado, that's just what we do. We don't have a choice about it. It's the thing we can't turn off. I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I do now. Section VII, the lockdown. The Vethkai moved at 800 station hours. Efficient. Organized. They came out of their section in 4 groups simultaneously. A tactical deployment that the station's security cameras captured in real time and that looked, watching it later, like something choreographed. Group 1 went for life support. Group 2 went for the main communications array. Group 3 positioned at the 3 primary transit intersections, the bottlenecks, the places where crowd movement could be controlled. Group 4 remained at the Vethkai section, which they'd converted into a defensible position because of course they had. The station population reacted in the way that populations of non-militarized beings react to organized armed force. Badly. There was panic in the main corridor. A Shalev merchant collapsed from what turned out to be a stress-induced metabolic episode. Several of the smaller species, the Keth and a group of Voan traders, immediately retreated to their ships in the docking bays, which was probably the smart move. Commander Rel got on the station-wide channel and said something measured and dignified about the situation being monitored, and everyone should remain calm. The Vethkai got on the station-wide channel immediately after and said anyone found interfering with their operations would be processed as a hostile element. That was their actual phrase, processed. I was in the operations center when all of this happened. I had my slate in my hand and I was simultaneously watching the security feeds, tracking my people's positions on the internal grid, and trying to get a signal out past the communications interference the Vethkai had set up, a soft block, not a hard cut, which was actually more sophisticated and therefore more alarming. Kale had our 12 people moving the moment Group 3 deployed, not toward the Vethkai positions, away from them, redistributing, taking up positions that didn't look like positions if you weren't looking for them. I watched him on the camera in Corridor 7, and I noticed something. He wasn't moving like a soldier expecting to fight. He was moving like a soldier who had accepted that fighting was inevitable and was now doing the math on where and when and how. There's a difference. The first is tension. The second is something colder and more focused. He caught one of the cameras, not on purpose, I don't think, but he looked up in that direction and I saw his face for a moment. Calm, completely and utterly calm. The Vethkai were 40, we were 12. The station was in lockdown. Help was hours away. Kale Oren looked calm. I found that either terrifying or comforting, and I still haven't decided which. Section VIII. What happened in the GRENN quarter? I have to tell you about Myra Chen before I tell you about what happened in the Gren quarter, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Myra was 24, medical officer, not combat rated, assigned to Karath because she'd specifically requested a posting that would let her work with multiple species. She was from Chengdu, which she mentioned approximately once every 2 conversations because she was proud of it in that particular way people are proud of specific places when they're far from home. She had a laugh that was about 30% too loud for enclosed spaces, and she knew it and did it anyway. She was in the Gren quarter when the lockdown happened because she'd been making her regular rounds. Gren physiology under station pressure conditions required monitoring that their own people didn't prioritize but that she'd made her personal project. She was also approximately 40 meters from a Group 3 checkpoint when the AI locked down the transit intersections. The checkpoint was 2 Vethkai in full operational gear. Between Myra and the checkpoint were 3 Gren residents of the quarter, elderly, non-combat, understandably frozen, and 1 Vethkai junior officer who appeared to be doing some kind of assessment of the section. I watched this on camera. I want to be clear. I watched it happen and there was nothing I could do from where I was, and that helplessness is something I've had to deal with separately, with professional help, and I mention it because it's part of the honest account. The junior officer said something to the Gren residents. I didn't have audio on that camera, but I could see the body language. The AI leaning toward them in that way they did, that deliberate use of height, that weight of presence designed to communicate something very specific. Myra stepped between them. I saw it happen and my stomach dropped. She was carrying her medical kit. She was 24 years old and not combat rated, and she stepped between a Vethkai junior officer and 3 elderly Gren residents, and she said something. I found out later what she said. The Gren residents told me, still somewhat stunned by it. She said, "They're my patients and they're going to their quarters now." The Vethkai junior officer looked at her for a long moment. This is the part that the Vethkai, when they were later interviewed by tribunal investigators, said they didn't fully understand. The officer reported that the human female showed no physiological signs of the fear submission response he expected. No elevated vocal tremor, no avoidance of eye contact, no backward lean in the body. She was, by all physical metrics, not afraid. Which was insane. She was absolutely afraid. I knew Myra well enough to know that. But there's something that happens with humans, this particular override that kicks in when we've decided that fear is irrelevant to the decision we've made. We can be terrified and still move forward. We don't need the fear to go away first. I'm not sure any other species in the compact fully understands that. The Vethkai officer stepped aside. He reported later that he made the calculation that a single medical officer was not a threat worth the complication of an incident, and that he let them pass based on tactical assessment. I don't think that's the real reason. I think he stepped aside because something in whatever the Vethkai have instead of instinct said, this one is not behaving like prey, and I don't know what that means yet. Myra got the 3 Gren to their quarters, and then she kept moving, conducting her rounds, for the next 4 hours, in a station under hostile occupation, with her medical kit and her loud laugh, and whatever that thing is that makes some humans simply incapable of stopping when there are people who need them. She treated 11 beings that day, 2 Tirath with crush injuries from the initial panic in the corridors, 4 Keth who'd been roughed up by Group 3 at a checkpoint, 3 Gren, 1 Shalav, and 1 Vethkai junior officer who'd taken a wall impact from the crowd surge and dislocated something in his second right upper limb. She treated him too. The Vethkai tribunal representatives brought that up later. They kept coming back to it. The human medical officer treating the injured Vethkai, they couldn't process it. In their framework, predator-prey, dominant-subordinate, it didn't fit. An occupied people's medic treating the occupier. Myra, when she was asked about it, said, "He was hurt, that's it, that's the whole reason." I think that single answer did more to change the Vethkai's understanding of humanity than anything that happened in the hangars. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Section IX, the hours in between. The middle hours of that day were strange. Tense in a particular way, not the sharp tension of immediate crisis, but the grinding tension of waiting. The Vethkai had control of life support and communications. They weren't doing anything with them yet. Commander Rel in the operations center said this quietly. They're waiting for acknowledgement. They want the station to formally capitulate before they demonstrate consequences. The Vethkai had done this before. Other stations, other populations. The pattern was documented. The Compact's threat assessment files on them were, I discovered that day, considerably more detailed than anyone had thought to brief us on before our posting. There had been 3 other incidents in neutral space in the past decade. All 3 had followed the same pattern: deployment, lockdown, demands, demonstration of force to encourage compliance, capitulation, and then 6 months of what the files carefully called administrative reorganization before the Compact could assemble enough political pressure to force withdrawal. 6 months. The beings at the Bay 7 incident had been the demonstration, the ones on the floor in the amber light. Commander Rel knew this. She sat in her chair in the operations center and she looked at the feeds and she said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "They will want a formal response within the hour." I had nothing, no response from ILC command, no support incoming. No options that didn't involve surrendering the station to beings who'd already shown what they did with the authority they took. I sent one more message to Kale, a simple one, not orders, a status update and a question. His response came back in under a minute. "Positioned, waiting for your signal, we don't need much. Give us a reason and we'll give them a memory." I stared at that for a long time. Give us a reason and we'll give them a memory. I thought about Commander Rel's question, the formal response due within the hour. I thought about the Keth on the floor of Bay 7. I thought about Myra walking through checkpoints with her medical kit and her Chengdu pride and her absolutely unacceptable calm. I thought about what 6 months of Vethkai, administrative reorganization, looked like. I thought about Kale's face on that corridor camera, that particular cold focus. I sent him back 2 words. Bay 9. Part 2, what Apex looks like. Document classification. Personal testimony continued. Filed by Warrant Officer de Savale, Interspecies Liaison Corps, Earth Expeditionary Attaché. Continuation of Part 1, The Soft Ones. Galactic Standard Date. Cycle 7440, 1.88. Status, unredacted, cleared for public archive by order of the Galactic Compact Tribunal. Section X, Bay 9. Bay 9 was in the human-built section of Karath. I want to explain what that means structurally, because it matters. The human section of Karath had been built by people who'd grown up on a planet where the infrastructure was old, underfunded, frequently jury-rigged, and always built with redundancy in mind. Because the thing about living on Earth is that you learn pretty early that systems fail. Generators go down. Water mains burst. Power grids collapse on exactly the hottest day of the summer. Civilization's margin of error, when you're actually living inside it rather than reading about it in a textbook, is uncomfortably thin. So when the human construction teams had built their section of Karath, they'd done something the Gren and Tirath teams hadn't. They'd put in backups for the backups. Life support had 3 independent systems, any one of which could carry the load. Communications had a hardline array that bypassed the main station network entirely and ran directly to a relay satellite that the Vethkai hadn't thought to jam because it looked, on their scans, like maintenance infrastructure. Power was on a distributed grid that could isolate any segment without losing the others. The Vethkai had taken control of the main station life support. They had not taken control of the human section's secondary systems, because no one told them those systems existed, because they hadn't asked, because they'd looked at the human-built section and seen improvised, messy, slightly embarrassing infrastructure, and decided it wasn't worth detailed analysis. Kale had 9 of our 12 people positioned in Bay 9 by the time I sent him the signal. The other 3 were somewhere else, doing something else, and I'll get to them. Bay 9 itself was a mid-sized cargo bay, large enough to run small vehicle maintenance operations, currently empty of major cargo because the convergence traffic had cleaned most storage bays out. It had 2 main entrances and 4 service hatches that the Vethkai almost certainly didn't know existed, because they'd been added by the human construction team and weren't on the standard station schematics. The Vethkai group that came to Bay 9, 6 of them, a standard fire team plus a senior officer, came because their surveillance had flagged the human personnel movements toward that section. They came to secure it, to demonstrate control, to remind the soft ones who was in charge now. They came in through the 2 main entrances. I was watching on the camera feeds from the operations center, with Commander Rel standing behind me. She'd stopped pretending to run the room and was just watching, and the Gren security chief Os on my other side. The 6 Vethkai came through the main entrances. The 9 humans came through the service hatches. And what happened next is the thing I can't fully describe, even now. Not because I don't remember it. I remember every second with that particular clarity that extreme stress burns into memory. But because there's a gap between what I watched and what I can make words do. Let me try anyway. Section XI, the hangar. The Vethkai fire team moved into Bay 9 in their formation, precise, trained. Each member covering an angle, the senior officer at the center with that particular loose-limbed readiness of someone who's done this many times. The bay was dim, The human section ran its lighting at about 70% during non-operational hours as a power conservation measure, and the Vethkai senior officer had clearly noticed this and was adjusting, because AI secondary eyes could compensate fairly well, and he wanted time for that compensation to complete. He got about 4 seconds. Kale came through the forward starboard service hatch. He wasn't in combat armor. None of us were, because we didn't have combat armor on Kareth. We had light tactical suits that were rated for pressure and temperature, but weren't designed to stop Vethkai impact force. He was carrying a collapsible impact tool, essentially a weighted baton about 40 centimeters long, and moving at a speed that the Bay 9 camera's tracking algorithm later had to reanalyze twice because it had miscalculated his approach vector. I'll say this once and then move on because I'm not comfortable dwelling on it. What Kale did in that hangar in the next 40 seconds was not easy to watch. It was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looks heroic from close up. It was the thing you do when you've made a specific decision, when you've turned something off inside yourself that normally keeps you from doing it, when you've accepted the cost and chosen the action anyway. He engaged the senior officer first because that's what you do, you remove command capability, and he did it fast and hard and without any of the hesitation that the Vethkai later said they couldn't understand. No warning call, no posturing, no use of size difference as psychological leverage first, the way they would have done it. Just here is the problem, here is the solution moving. The other 8 humans came through the remaining hatches simultaneously. The Vethkai fire team had 4 upper limbs each, better reach, significantly higher individual mass, chitin that deflected a lot of what would have ended the engagement immediately against softer targets. What they did not have was the particular thing that Kale had identified, back in that quiet conversation over tea, as the variable the Vethkai hadn't calculated. They did not have the thing that humans do when something we care about is threatened. Private Teodora Vazic, who was 26 years old and had grown up in Belgrade, and once told me she'd wanted to be a structural engineer before life got interesting, took a hit from a Vethkai second limb that would have sent most beings off the engagement entirely. It cracked 2 of her ribs. I know this from the medical report. At the time, she registered it, took 1 breath and kept fighting. Lieutenant James Ape, who was 33 and very quiet in ordinary conversation, but apparently had a lot to say when it was time to say it with his body, found a gap in the AI fire team's formation. A gap that shouldn't have existed, that only existed because the Vethkai had not expected to be fighting beings who'd keep coming after they'd taken hits, and went through it. 1 by 1 and in aggregate 9 human beings, none of them combat rated beyond the basic qualification, none of them in proper armor, one of them fighting with 2 broken ribs, took apart a Vethkai fire team. Not quickly, not elegantly, not without cost, but completely. The Vethkai senior officer, when he regained functional consciousness, his distributed neural cluster meant he'd be fine eventually, but it took time, reportedly said to the Gren security personnel who came to assist. They did not stop. He said it like it was a question, like he was still trying to understand. They took damage and they did not stop. Section XII the 3. Now I'll tell you about the other 3. The 3 humans who weren't in Bay 9. Private Yuki Tanaka, Specialist Rodrigo Almeida, and a civilian contractor named Ben Park, who had a technical rating that covered 17 different station systems, and who had joined Kale's team not because he was supposed to, but because he'd been standing there when Kale was making his plan and had said, in the most matter-of-fact voice, "I can fix the comms if you give me 20 minutes and don't let anyone kill me while I'm doing it." Kale had looked at him for a moment and said, "Okay." That was the whole process. Ben Park joined the operation. While Bay 9 happened, those 3 were doing something else. Tanaka and Almeida had spent the hours of waiting doing something that looked, on the station's internal sensors, exactly like anxious personnel sheltering in place. They were in a maintenance corridor adjacent to the Vethkai section. They were waiting. Ben Park was in the communications relay room in the human section. He was working. At the moment Bay 9 started, time to the second, Tanaka and Almeida popped a maintenance panel in the corridor wall and accessed a specific environmental control junction. Not life support, temperature regulation. The Vethkai section of the station in the next 4 minutes dropped 11 degrees, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that Vethkai chitin, that remarkable substance that shrugs off radiation and pressure, has a stiffness coefficient that changes significantly in the cold. Their fourth group, the one guarding their home section, didn't become incapacitated, but they slowed. Their reaction times extended. Their combat readiness went from peak to compromised. 11 degrees, achieved through a maintenance panel in a corridor by 2 people with hand tools. The Vethkai had not modeled this, because who thinks to model environmental control as a weapon when you're the ones who have control of life support? At the same moment, Ben Park finished his work on the communications relay. The hardline array, the one that looked like maintenance infrastructure, started transmitting on every compact monitored emergency frequency it could reach. Not a distress call. Ben Park was smarter than that. The Vethkai would have recognized a distress call pattern and would have jammed it somehow. What he sent was the raw, unedited footage from Bay 9, live. To every frequency. Every ship in the outer meridian approach lanes. Every relay satellite in range. Every compact monitoring station within signal reach. 40 Vethkai soldiers occupying a civilian station in neutral space. The Bay 7 attack footage, the checkpoint intimidation footage, and now Bay 9, 9 humans dismantling a Vethkai fire team. All of it, unedited, with station timestamps and coordinate tags. Not a distress call. A record. Incontrovertible, real-time, broadcast to everyone record. The Vethkai commander, Decimator, in our private lexicon, found out about the transmission 12 minutes after it started. By then it had already been received and acknowledged by 2 compact enforcement vessels, a Gren diplomatic courier, and this part was not planned but was absolutely perfect. A Shalev news relay ship that had been sitting in the approach queue and whose broadcast antenna immediately started retransmitting everything. Decimator made his decision in the next 6 minutes. The tribunal documents show his internal communications from that period, and they show a being recalculating, running new numbers, looking at his situation and finding that the math had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The soft ones had backed him into a transmission. Not a fight, not a standoff, a record. Everything the Vethkai had done, and everything that had been done in response, was now the property of compact-wide communication networks. Decimator gave the stand-down order. Section XIII after. The Vethkai stood down at 13:47 station hours. The whole thing had taken just under 6 hours. Help arrived, 3 compact enforcement vessels and a Gren diplomatic contingent. 4 hours after that, by which time Commander Rel had formally resumed station authority, and the Vethkai were in a very particular kind of political situation that I am told, by people who understand compact legal mechanisms better than I do, was historically unprecedented for species of their status. I was in Bay 9 when Kale came out. He had blood on his hands, his own, from a Vethkai impact that had opened something in his right palm, and he was breathing carefully, the way you breathe when something in your chest tells you breathing is going to be a project for a while. Later we'd confirm, 2 broken ribs, same as Teodora. He'd had them for most of the operation and hadn't mentioned it. He sat down against the bay wall, and I sat next to him. Neither of us said anything for a while. "They're down," he said finally. "Standing down, it's done." He nodded, looked at his hands. The comms worked. Ben Park sends his regards. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. I'll buy him a coffee. The station fabricator's coffee is terrible. Yeah, Cale said. It always is. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then, how are my people? I gave him the tally. Mostly manageable. Teodora and Cale himself, ribs. 3 others with injuries that rated medical attention but nothing catastrophic. No fatalities. On our side, no fatalities. He took that in, processed it with his eyes still closed. Good, he said. The word came out different from how it looks on a page. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something quieter. The particular quality of someone who'd been carrying a weight and could, for just a second, put part of it down. Myra found us about 20 minutes later. She was still carrying her medical kit. She looked at both of us with an expression that was approximately 2 parts relief and 1 part professional disapproval. And she sat down on Cale's other side and started working on his hand without asking permission. The Vethkai officer, she said while she worked, the one I treated this morning, he asked about it again. Asked about what? I said. Why I helped him. I told him you were hurt. He said that wasn't an answer. Cale opened one eye. What did you say? I said it's the only answer there is. She paused, pressing gauze against the cut in his palm. He sat there for a while. Then he said, that is the part we did not calculate, just like that, like he was reading it from a report. The 3 of us sat with that for a moment. That is the part we did not calculate. Section XIV, what the Vethkai thought they knew. The tribunal took 3 months. I testified for 11 days across 4 sessions. The others testified too: Cale, Myra, Ben Park, Teodora, Os, Commander Rel, all of them. The Vethkai gave their own account, which was, and this is the thing that still stays with me, genuinely honest. They weren't defensive or evasive. They said essentially, we assessed this situation, we made our calculations, we were wrong, here is where we were wrong. The part where they were wrong was more extensive than any of us had guessed. They had calculated our physical parameters correctly. Bone density, pain response ranges, oxygen dependence, sleep requirements, all accurate. They had modeled our reaction times and found them inferior to Vethkai response rates by a factor of approximately 30%. They had assessed our physical force output and found it lower than their own by a significant margin. All of this was true. What they had not calculated, what they had, in their own words, not thought to include in the model, was what happened to those parameters under specific conditions. A human who has decided that the alternative is worse than the risk. A human who has made that particular choice that turns off whatever is supposed to stop us, does not move at 30% below Vethkai reaction time. A human who has accepted that they are going to take damage and keep going doesn't fight like their pain response parameters suggest. The Vethkai model was accurate for humans in neutral situations. It was catastrophically wrong for humans in the specific situation of, something I care about is being threatened, and I have decided to act. The decimator, his formal name was Commander Vreth-Kaz, which the tribunal records use, but to me he's still decimator, said something in testimony that made the chamber very quiet. He said, we studied every species we have encountered in terms of their combat capabilities. We have faced beings who were stronger, faster, more resilient, more lethal. We have never faced a species whose capabilities changed in the presence of commitment. He paused. The tribunal panel waited. When a Vethkai decides to fight, he said, we fight at our capabilities. The capabilities are the same regardless of emotional state. We understood that other species functioned similarly. We believed the human physical parameters were fixed. Another pause. They are not fixed. We do not know why they are not fixed. The tribunal representative from the Gren delegation. A very old being named Esavar, who had been on the compact for longer than any human had been in space, said something in response that I've quoted many times since. Esavar said, "The humans evolved on a world that was trying to kill them. The world had more capabilities than they did. They survived by changing what they were capable of. You studied what they are. You didn't ask what they were trained to become under pressure. That is the thing you missed." Vrethkaz looked at this old grin representative for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that is the thing we missed." Section XV, Things I Learned. I learned things in those 3 months of tribunal testimony that changed how I understood my own species. The Vethkai weren't the first to misread us. They were just the first to get the lesson sharply enough to sit in a tribunal chamber and admit it. The Shalev had done a study, years before, that had concluded humans were likely to be a stable if unremarkable member of the compact, non-aggressive, cooperative-leaning, politically manageable. That study had noted, in a footnote that nobody had apparently flagged, that human history showed a remarkable pattern of resource commitment beyond calculated survival threshold. In other words, humans kept going in situations where the math said stop. The study had listed this as a behavioral anomaly and moved on. It wasn't an anomaly, it was the whole point. The Gren diplomatic files, Esavar showed me some of these, afterward, in one of those conversations that happens outside official sessions, included a report from the first human contact mission that said, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, the humans demonstrated a peculiar insistence on continued engagement despite adverse probability assessments. It is unclear whether this represents cognitive limitation regarding risk analysis or a value structure that deprioritizes self-preservation in favor of other commitments. Further observation recommended. Further observation. 80 years of it, apparently, without anyone writing up the conclusion. The conclusion, which I'll state as plainly as I can. We're not the strongest. We're not the fastest. We don't heal the quickest or see the farthest or survive the worst environments without equipment. But we are, as far as any species in the compact has yet encountered, entirely unique in one specific way. We change the equation when the thing we care about is on the other side of it. We have a thing inside us, some evolutionary hangover from 3 million years of being small and soft on a planet that was absolutely trying to eat us, that, when activated, does not accept the math as final. When activated, it says, I know the odds and I am going to try anyway. When activated, it takes the fixed parameters of human physical capability and does something that should not be physiologically possible, which is to ignore them. Adrenaline is not a sufficient explanation. Every species has analogs to adrenaline. The Vethkai did a detailed study, afterward, partly for the tribunal, partly, I think, out of genuine fascination. They interviewed every human involved in the Kareth incident. They looked at the cortisol, the epinephrine, the neural activity markers, all of it. Their conclusion, formally submitted to the tribunal in a document that became, quietly, one of the most circulated pieces of xenobiological literature in the compact. The humans are not operating on enhanced physiological capability alone. There is an additional factor we cannot fully quantify. When the commitment threshold is crossed, when the human has decided, fully and without internal reservation, to act, there is a change in the relationship between pain signal and motor function, between fear response and forward motion, between self-preservation instinct and chosen behavior, that does not match any known biological model. The humans appear to be able to use the decision itself as fuel. The decision itself as fuel. I read that and I sat with it for a long time. Because it's true. I don't know how to explain it in biological terms, but I know what it feels like from the inside, and fuel is a good word. When you've made the choice, the real one, the one you're not going back on, something in you stops arguing and starts moving. It doesn't feel brave. It doesn't feel like a conscious choice to overcome fear. It just feels like I've decided, now I'm going. Section XVI. Myra's question. 3 weeks after the tribunal concluded, I had dinner with Myra in the human section's common room. It had been refurbished. The whole station had been refurbished in the aftermath, partly because the convergence had highlighted how much deferred maintenance existed, partly because the compact had suddenly found the budget for significant investment in Karath Station for reasons that were politically obvious. The common room had new lighting. Someone had set up an actual plant, a small, determined fern in a pressurized container that had no business surviving this far from Earth and was apparently doing fine. We talked about a lot of things. The tribunal, what came next for both of us, whether the fabricator coffee was ever going to get better, was our consensus, but we'd stopped minding. Then Myra said something I wasn't expecting. She said, "Do you ever wonder if we're doing it right?" I looked at her. Doing what right? All of it being out here, how we're doing it. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Because I keep thinking about what Vrethkaz said, about how they saw us. And I think part of what made them see us that way is that we were trying so hard to be palatable, easy to work with, non-threatening. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think some part of them read it as emptiness, like we'd given up the thing that made us worth taking seriously. I thought about that. And then when it mattered, she continued, we stopped being palatable and just were what we are. And that was the thing they hadn't seen before. Are you saying we should have been less palatable from the start? No, she shook her head. I'm saying I think the palatable part is real too. The cooperation, the goodwill, all of that. I think that's genuinely us. A pause. But I think the other part is also genuinely us. And maybe the mistake for them was thinking those two things couldn't exist in the same species. I thought about Kale in the hangar. Myra stepping between that Vethkai officer and 3 elderly Gren residents. Ben Park with his hand tools and his 20 minutes. Teodora with 2 broken ribs not stopping. And the same Myra who'd done all of that, sitting here in a refurbished common room with a cup of terrible coffee, asking careful, honest questions about whether we were doing this right. Both things, same people. I don't think they'll make that mistake twice, I said. She smiled. No, I don't think they will. Section XVI. Kael's last word on it. I spoke to Kale the day before he was transferred out. He'd been promoted, which surprised him more than it should have, and reassigned to a senior liaison posting at Compact Central. A real posting, significant, the kind of thing that happens when someone has done something that changes the record. He was packing up his quarters, which in practice meant moving a bag and a tea kit because Kale traveled light in all senses. I asked him, when you went into that hangar, were you scared? He gave me the look he gives questions he considers only technically difficult. Yes, he said. But you went anyway. Yeah. Why? He picked up his tea kit, set it in the bag, thought about the question as if it was worth thinking about, which I appreciated. Because being scared doesn't mean being stopped, he said finally. The Vethkai I think they thought fear and backing down were the same thing, that if you put enough threat in front of a species, the fear would translate into retreat, and if they retreated enough times, they'd understand their position. And fear is just information. It's telling you the situation is serious. It's not telling you what to do about it. He looked at me. We'd be dead as a species on our own planet 10,000 times over if we'd let fear tell us what to do. We're not wired that way. We're wired to be scared and to do the thing anyway. That's a good quality to have. It's a complicated quality to have, he said. Makes us hard to live with, I think, from the outside. Hard to predict. Yeah, he sipped the last of his terrible fabricator coffee. Hard to predict, hard to stop. A pause. That's the thing, isn't it? Most species have threat response systems that terminate engagement at a survivability threshold. The math says stop, they stop. It's rational. And us? Our threat response system doesn't have a clean off switch, Cale said. Once it's on, once we've decided, the math is no longer the deciding factor. The decision is. He picked up his bag. They called us prey, he said. And I understand why. We look like prey. We're not the biggest or the toughest or the most armored, but they forgot what it took for us to survive long enough to get here. A pause at the door. Prey doesn't make it off a death world, he said. Prey doesn't cross the ocean in a wooden boat not knowing what's on the other side. Prey doesn't walk on the moon and then go back for more. He looked at me. We're not prey. We never were. We just look that way until we've decided we're not. Section XVI. What happened after? The Vethkai were, for the first time in recorded compact history, formally sanctioned. The process took longer than it should have and involved more political negotiation than justice strictly required, which is how these things go. But the outcome was real. More significantly, and I say this as someone who's spent the years since working in interspecies relations, and therefore has strong feelings about what actually changes things versus what just looks like change. The Kareth incident altered how the Compact understood humans. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation, more like a collective recalibration, a shift in how we were categorized, discussed, referenced in briefings. The Shalev Studies footnote, the one about resource commitment beyond calculated survival threshold, got pulled from the archive and reanalyzed. A new paper came out of the Compact's Xenological Institute that cited it specifically, and drew the line from it to Kareth Station and argued, with considerable evidence, that humanity had been systematically undercategorized from the beginning of contact. The paper's title, in translated Compact Common, The Persistence Variable, Why Standard Threat Assessment Models Fail for Human Subjects. Ben Park framed a copy, hung it in his workshop. I know this because he sent me a picture with a message that said, I'm going to need more wall space. Myra went on to establish the first multi-species field medicine unit in neutral space, which operates to this day and treats every being that needs it regardless of political circumstance, including. This became a sort of quiet institutional statement, Vethkai personnel on their very occasional compact sanction transits. Teodora Vazik became a structural engineer. She finished her degree on leave. She designed a habitat module for deep space relay stations that is now in use across the outer meridian, and that includes, as a design principle she insists on in every build, redundant systems behind the redundant systems. Everything has a second option, she told an interviewer once, and a third. You build for the failure you planned and then you build for the failure you didn't. She said it like it was obvious, like it was the only way to think. Cale was at Compact Central for 3 years. He retired from active service after that, and I'm not sure what he does now. The last message I got from him said he was somewhere with bad coffee and interesting problems, which sounded exactly right. I finished my ILC posting and came back to Earth for a year, walked around on a planet, breathed real air, slept in a room that wasn't vibrating with thermal expansion from binary suns. Then I went back. Because that's what we do. Section XIX, what I want you to understand. I've been asked many times to summarize what Kareth Station means. To the Compact, to human-alien relations, to the question of where humanity fits in the larger galaxy. I always find the question slightly wrong because where humanity fits implies a space that existed before we arrived and that we're supposed to slot into neatly. That's not how it went. That's not how it goes with humans, as the Vethkai would tell you. We don't fit into spaces, we change them. Not always dramatically, not always loudly, often in the quietly stubborn way that Ben Park fixed a communications relay with hand tools, Or Myra treated an injured enemy because he was hurt, and that was the whole reason. The galaxy didn't know what to do with that. The galaxy had a very developed understanding of power, who had it, who didn't, how it moved between species, what it meant when someone pushed and someone else stepped back. The whole compact political architecture was built on that understanding. And then there was this one species from a middling rocky planet that had somehow crawled out of a succession of near extinctions and civilizational collapses and wars that should have been their last and just kept finding reasons to try again. Not because the math said it was a good idea. Because they decided. The Vethkai thought they were going to walk into Kareth Station and find prey. They found something else. They found the descendants of every human being who had ever faced a wall, a real one, not a metaphor, not a difficult problem, a wall, something that said, "You stop here, this is as far as you go," and had looked at it and said, "Not yet, not today." They found, in other words, what Apex looks like when it doesn't come from size or strength or armor. When it comes from the thing you can't calculate. The decision.